Hello, I'm Rhian Jones from the Government Digital Service in the UK Cabinet Office. This is a short presentation about our API strategy and the process that we undertook to update our standards. GDS leads the government's digital data and technology function, helping departments build and run services that are digital by default and focused on the needs of citizens. Our API data and technical standards guidance helps government departments and local authorities create robust APIs. The standards are there to promote development, consistency, increase efficiency, reduce costs, and provide better digital public services. We operate an API-first build-to-share strategy, and we publish our APIs over the internet by default. In terms of standards, there's shared ownership across the UK government, but this is facilitated by GDS as a central role. In government, we've had great difficulty in sharing information because APIs were not standardised. Due to interoperability problems, departments and local councils were often limited to which applications from the public sector that they could reuse. There are some pockets of best practice. For example, HMRC, our Tax, Revenue and Customs Department, has been doing this for years, opening up its systems so that third-party software providers can help people and companies manage their tax more effectively. However, broad use cases and adoption isn't being seen across government, and this is something that we need to figure out, as the benefits can be great. By implementing APIs, digital departments are able to reduce operating costs by partially automating their work. For example, we know that the cost of incorporating an external API within a platform is always lower than developing a new API from zero, and it also avoids us having to reinvent the wheel. The Institute for Government, an influential think tank, notes that there's been less progress in using private APIs inside government, and that if they were used more widely, government would operate more effectively and flexibly so new services could be built and adapted rapidly. The report highlights that the use of APIs is suggested and not required, and that producing standards for APIs will help to improve this and make the outcomes a reality. It urges GDS, where I work, to curate rather than impose standards. So let's have a look at our vision. In February 2017, we published the Government Transformation Strategy. In it, we promised to support one of 7 priorities by 2020, which was going wholesale by expanding the number of available and supported APIs. Our strategy is focused on moving away from monolithic systems that are intended to perform a large number of tasks to individual components that communicate with each other through APIs and which are shared across government, rather than bound to organisational silos. We've also promised to introduce guidance and standards for APIs for both internal and external services, and this will include further consideration of how best the private sector can reuse our services. We're also committed to doing this in the open and to provide assurance of public-facing APIs built across government. Let's talk about some of the barriers and opportunities that we've faced in developing our strategy. So in terms of people, there are different types of capability and different balances of capability within both local and national government. Some bits have more experience and expertise than others. In terms of process, we need to reduce organisational silos. There are 25 departments in national government, over 152 local authorities in England and Wales, and we need to try and see if we can work together appropriately. And in terms of technology, we need to agree our technical implementation. We mitigated this by getting access to subject matter experts. We had experts within GDS on individual areas, so experts in open standards, data APIs, data formatting, and transactional APIs. We also had high-profile experts to help us push the agenda. In terms of open standards, the UK government already had a robust process for open standards in place and had already adopted standards such as UT8 for encoding and GeoJSON for geographic data. And in terms of sponsorship, we were backed by senior technologists across the whole of the UK government, and we had a dedicated budget. So we've recently developed an API standards project for UK public authorities, working with iStand UK, the local government agency designed to promote standards for efficiency, transformation and transparency of local services. So this is bringing together departments and local councils together to brainstorm API standards. The API standards project has involved cross-government, both central and local collaboration, as well as collaboration with the wider public sector such as Network Rail to create a common set of API standards. So we needed a place to start from. So we had a group of subject matter experts at GDS in different areas. We brought them together to discuss the foundation for the standards, to find out what was controversial, what wasn't, and where we needed to invest our time and attention. We ran a brainstorm where experts listed topics and technologies in a series of areas into sort of three main buckets. So the first was the sort of definite answers, things that we were confident about, for example, HTTP and JSON. The second one was best practice. What do we know are strong opinions, but there's more one answer that we might agree on, for example, OAuth. And possibilities. We wanted to discuss what we were doing at GDS, but we wanted to discuss this openly, for example, using Swagger for documentation and versioning. We then needed to verify our assumptions, so we held 4 large cross-government events in partnership with iStand UK, bringing departments and local councils together to discuss API strategies and standards. Some example discussions were on versioning. The community recognised that there were different types of APIs, transactional and data. Data APIs being those defined as those that are purely about data access. We talked about the difference of versioning these types of APIs, for example, adding a version number to a URL and making backwards incompatible changes for transactional APIs. In terms of authentication, not everyone agreed with using OAuth 2 for authorization. We'd been experimenting with JSON Web Tokens at the time, and we had to decide whether it was fair to set standards on what was in use or to leave it open. We published our early thinking, including those controversial points about API standards, in a series of blog posts, so we did much of the process in the open. We now have a set of cross-government set of API standards that are iterated. Due to information and application reuse, our API standards will save the public sector money and show our UK lead on this. The standards set out how we expect APIs to be built, following consistent design and principles. For example, iteration, versioning, HTTPS, use of URIs, authentication, authorization, and data design. The standards are a starting point. They recognise that they will be used in different situations across government. So where an exact standard isn't possible, the content is clear of what is expected of the user and when they can choose an appropriate option for their situation. For example, we say to follow the industry standard and where appropriate. For example, you might not want to use a REST API when building an API to stream data. In time, we will develop some sort of architectural assessment process to evaluate whether new APIs meet the API technical and data standards. We supplement the standards with relevant guidance. These standards explain what we expect from government teams building APIs, and the guidance provides more detail on how to actually achieve the standards. We're working on new changes based on user research, feedback from the cross-government API community, and senior technology leads across government. We're also working with our tax and revenue department to learn from their API design process. We've had some discussions with them about creating an agnostic version of their process for other government departments to use. And all of our APIs are published on data.gov.uk, which is made publicly available. So what we learned in doing this. So when you're forming standards, you think we need to understand who the lead practitioners are in each specific area and to take your lead from them, to avoid being led completely down the wrong path, given that there's so many diverse contrasting views in technology. Secondly, we need to keep the standards about practical implementation and not theoretical what might be ideas. Thirdly, build a community to gain agreement and buy-in. Create a core community of people who are interested in setting standards and keep them regularly updated with events. Make the events engaging and find your lead practitioners at these events, much in the same way as our colleagues have done. Share the work on standards openly and be open to feedback, but give your contributors strict deadlines for giving their ideas and responses. Work on the principles of iteration. Everything doesn't have to be done in the first draft, and with future iterations you can go into more detail and add more qualifications if necessary. And finally, keep the standards minimal and link off to guidance, policy and study documents where helpful. Thanks very much.